questions? Yes.
Are you aware if any of the acolytes or followers or descendants of this McCarthy era of blacklisting is involved today
I'm sorry.
in our lives, in our politics?
You're saying, do I know anybody who is, I'm sorry.
Influenced followers of Joseph McCarthy's anti-communism?
I don't know. I don't know. I can't answer that. Yes.
Tom, your parents wrote the screenplay. What was it, your father that wrote the screenplay for The Boy with the Green Hair?
Yeah, I wrote it.
Okay. Do you know what year that was exactly?
1948.
And was it just your father or both your parents?
It was my father and another collaborator who was also blacklisted.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is there a second novel coming soon?
I'm sorry?
Is there a second novel coming soon?
Not for a while. Not for a while. This one is it took me quite a few years to get this one together, and I don't know if I'm going to live long enough to. Other questions? Yes.
So, is there a reason why you would choose to write fiction as opposed to memoir?
It's more fun. I just found it more, when I tried writing about myself, I kind of got into self-indulgent trains of thought. And then I tried mixing things up and fictionalizing things, and I just enjoyed it a lot more. And I found that I was able to create believable scenes and situations and characters. So I just really, that's what I did for the rest of my life.
We have time for one more.
Yes.
That blacklisting, was it only about Hollywood, or it included other businesses statewide or countrywide?
It included all areas of American life. There were blacklisted doctors, blacklisted lawyers. Many different fields were affected by the McCarthy period.
Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. I know there were a few more hands, so if you have more questions, feel free to come up and talk to Thomas after our presentations are over. We are on to our last author, James Curran. He is a newspaper reporter, blogger, author, and stand-up comedian. His writing has covered several topics such as sports, crime, and religion for newspapers across California, and his work's been featured in publications such as USA Today. This afternoon, he's here to present his mystery novel, Assumption Day. Please join me in welcoming James Curran.
Guys, I want to start off by saying, on behalf of the other gentlemen here, we are extremely grateful that you guys showed up. So if you do me a favor, give yourselves a little bit of a round of applause. Now, before I tell you how allegedly amazing I think I am, what I want to do is I want to tell you guys a little bit about what happens after you write a book, okay, after you get something published. You have a lot of friends in this world, and they're very nice people, and they all come up and they tell you, James, my God, this is an achievement. Congratulations. You've heard it too, haven't you? This is an achievement. And it's a wonderful thing to hear. It's a great ego stroke. But the thing that caught me about it is it illustrated one of the great ironies of life overall. In good times and in bad, achievements and in times of challenge, we always ask ourselves the same question. Why me? You see. Because I had to ask myself what an achievement really is. See, to me, an achievement is not just something that's great, but something that's great in a time when it's least expected. Like beating cancer. That's an achievement. And you know what's an even bigger achievement than beating cancer once? Beating it twice. You know what's an even bigger achievement than beating it twice? 3 times, like my father. My father has been battling it, and he has defeated it 3 consecutive times. And today, he and his wife, my mom, have made the trip all the way down from Apple Valley to support me tonight. Please, just for a moment, give my father a bit of applause. Dad, I love you. That is an achievement. Seriously. Now, onto my ego. I want to start off by telling you guys a little bit about Assumption Day, okay? Assumption Day is a historical fiction murder mystery. It takes place in 1970s in Northern Ireland, okay? Now, for those of you who know anything about Irish history, there has been a long battle between the Protestants and the Catholics. It's been going on for centuries, very violent, very ugly. But in 1970, there was this brief moment of a ceasefire. But just because there's a ceasefire, there's not peace. And so these young Catholics want to get rights for themselves. And they hear about an American who had passed away just a bit before, named Martin Luther King, who achieved great things through peace marches. So they try their own peace march, and 5 people die. And it is up to the one trustworthy inspector in the Royal Ulster Constabulary to solve the crime before the whole region implodes in war. Now you might be kind enough to say, hey James, great, read some of it. But I won't. I can't. Mr. Levitt over here was kind enough to read some of his novel, which I respect. I can't do it because it's a murder mystery. And if I start reading a murder mystery, y'all are going to guess who did it. And then there's no reason to buy the book. So I just can't go out and do that. Some of you will be like, hey, the butler did it. And I'm like, dude, it's in Ireland. There are no butlers in Ireland. The Irish are more likely to be butlers than they are to have them. So instead, what I wanted to do today was to tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book. Okay? Now, I'm curious, some of you people, a little bit of applause or hand raise. How many of you have a book in your head that you're trying to write, that you want to write? Man, there's a wave of applause, isn't there? Thank you, I appreciate that. A lot of us have inspirations, aspirations for a story that we want to write, or something that we want to invent, or make the world a better place, right? Now, that is a what. And for me, Assumption Day would have never been written if I didn't have the why. If you don't have the why you're doing something, it's not going to happen. Your inspiration will die, and it'll never finish. I think I speak for you guys, for you as well, correct? You needed to know that this is why I'm writing this book. A what without a strong why is the beginning of delusion. So I had 3 strong whys as to why I had to get Assumption Day published. Okay? Now the first is my family, heritage, culture, whatever you choose to call it. See, my father is an Irish immigrant. He was the younger of 3 brothers from County Clare, the Republic of Ireland. Thank you. I agree, you too. Really? County Clare? Oh, dang. Did you lose the accent?
No, I wasn't born there, my great-grandparents were.
Oh yeah, you see my father, and I'm going to narc on you here, my father swears he lost the accent. Talk to him after. You didn't lose the accent, Dad. It's still there. But when I was a kid, my dad would tell me these stories about Ireland, but they were so brief, and there were these gaps. And I only knew a few stories then, so when I became a young man, I wanted to learn my heritage. And I would go to these Irish import shops and learn about Ireland. And I found some things about my family that may be true or maybe not. My family actually does allegedly trace to Northern Ireland. And that means there's a good possibility that some of my relatives might have been in the IRA. I don't know this to be true, but it might be. And I'm sitting there going, hey, this is awesome. Some of my people are angry. You know, they're like freedom fighters and stuff like that. But then I had other relatives tell me I was full of mess, so I don't think so. But the study that I made, it brought me to the conclusions about the complexity of Irish culture, okay? As I mentioned earlier, it's the Catholics and the Protestants, and they've been going at it for centuries. See, we in the United States, we have our own issues with social justice. Would you agree?
Yes.
Absolutely. Back then, when the British would try to take over Ireland, they didn't care about social justice at all. Not in the slightest. So when we look at our own civil rights issues here in America, that's relatively a compressed time frame. Imagine the animosity that builds between two types of people over the course of 9 centuries. Bitterness, angry, just waiting, anything could set the powder keg going. The story that I wrote, for example, takes place in a city that is so consumed by anger they can't even agree on the name. To the Protestants, it's Londonderry. The Catholics are like, we don't want nothing to do with London. It's Derry. And it's just that petty. It's amazing. Now, I'm not trying to say any of this to say, hey, we should all support the IRA. That's not the point. I'm just asking what happens. How much stuff has to go on before you actually consider taking arms against your oppressor? How many centuries, how many years, what has to go on? That's what led to this story. Now, I'm not saying that we in the United States are done with civil rights. I'm not even trying to begin to say that at all. What I am suggesting is that at least try to hear people out when it comes to civil rights and oppression, okay? Because you don't want 900 years of anger coming into your backyard. That's if there is a message I want to leave, that's one. Now, the second reason I wrote it, oddly enough, is Martin Luther King. Because I mentioned this was in 1970s. He had passed a couple years before, but he was the inspiration for the parades. In our own country, have you ever noticed that the number of civil rights leaders that have made an impact as opposed to the ones that haven't? I became obsessed with this. Just completely obsessed, because in my opinion, King is the only one who accomplished massive civil change. And I think that matters. I mean, it matters because we've had all these other people try to claim King's mantle. And who has, after all this time? We've had Sharpton, Cindy Sheehan. We have a bunch of well-meaning kids out in Florida trying to affect social change. I don't know if they'll be able to do it, but I will tell you this. I studied the idea of what made King able to change the world. I was consumed by it. I went through, I would read philosophy, I would read social readings, and it occurred to me after all that time that maybe the reason that King was able to make change was because he was a preacher. Because when you're a preacher, one of the things that you say is you come from the standpoint of loving your enemies. It is not easy to love your enemies. Not at all. I mean, so many other people who come out, they come from a standpoint of we want this, period. They don't think about loving the people around them first. It's so vital to do that. And it's so difficult. Now, loving your enemies doesn't mean submit to them, but it's just a challenge. And for centuries, as you can imagine, nobody in Ulster, Northern Ireland, was interested in loving their enemies. You'll see it in my novel. There's a character who desperately wants to bring about civil rights for the Catholics. Desperate to do it. He knows what King accomplished, but he's struggling to figure out how to make it happen in Northern Ireland too. The struggle for that guy, that character, was most definitely real. Now, the third reason I wrote it was for the main character, Chief Inspector Jack Hamilton. I read a lot of mystery books, and a lot of them are just different types of characters. You know, we have the hard-drinking cop, things like that. I didn't do that route. I chose an everyman who is under this false belief that the law leads to peace. I don't believe the law leads to peace at all. I think it's a feeble attempt to try and make us be nice to each other, but I often think it doesn't work. I've traveled the country doing comedy and writing. I've been to Ferguson, Missouri. Not during the Michael Brown thing, but about a year after. I was in Sanford, Florida, about a year after Trayvon Martin got killed. And the local news, they would write these articles about their passing. And they always had this weird side story about the one local cop who was trying to make a difference and how it didn't, how this was putting pressure on him. And at the moment, I thought that was kind of an idiotic story to write, but now I kind of understand. Because his belief, my main character's belief, if you will, is if I get enough bad guys off the street, at some point people will get it. At some point we will stop being so evil to each other, so mean. And I don't know how many of you guys read philosophy, but I came to the conclusion that if Sisyphus had lived today, he would be a beat cop. It's going to be impossible to do that. So I wanted to have that struggle illustrated. Now understand, I didn't preach about it in the book. I pulled a lot of it out. I want these sort of things to be extremely subtle under the line of the story. So just to basically get to the point, I had 3 reasons that I absolutely had to do. All the rewrites, all the things the publisher wanted, all the things everybody wanted in order to get Assumption Day to the book stand today. Those things: faith, the faith of Dr. Martin Luther King; hope, the hope of Chief Inspector Jack Hamilton to bring peace to Northern Ireland; and love, love of my family, love of my heritage. Or to quote a better writer than I, faith, hope, and love. These 3. But the greatest of these is love. Guys, it's been my pleasure to chat with you. If you want to get a copy of Assumption Day today, by all means, it's in the back. You can also find it on Bookstore.com, thewildrosepress.com, Amazon, iBooks, and Kindle. And if you'd like to get to know me afterwards, aside from this, you can find me on Facebook at James Curran. This is kind of hard to ignore. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at @CurranWrites. I am thankful to meet you today. What would you guys like to talk about? Yes, ma'am.
Any law enforcement people in your family or your distant family that maybe were models for you?
That is actually an interesting question. If you didn't hear it, she asked if I had any friends or relatives who worked in law enforcement that served as a model. In an odd way, now that you phrased the question that way, I could argue that my brother might have been part of the source of this. My brother, for a while, worked for San Bernardino Police Department. Now, if you've ever been to San Bernardino, you probably got out really fast. My brother, God love him, he worked there for a year in the toughest part of a really ugly town. And we haven't really spoke about why he left, but he did leave. And he currently chose an entirely different field. He lives in Florida with his fiance, and I'm happy for him. I'm happy that being around such violence didn't change him. I appreciate the question. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Do you think the Irish are resenting the English more now than they did, say, 20, 30 years ago?
The question was, do I think that the Irish resent the British more now than they did 20 or 30 years ago? Now, I can only give you anecdotal evidence. The answer, in my opinion, is no. The reason, now, doesn't mean it's completely wiped out. I do know people who are, in fact, IRA supporters. They would like the IRA to come back. And I mean, that just shows you how the echoes of anger resonate through the years. But during my research of the book, the vast majority of the people that I talk to, including my own father, they abhor the IRA and all it stands for. So anecdotally, my belief is no. Yes, sir.
Are there any positive Irish, characters on TV that you would model some of the characters on?
I've always been fond of the Lucky Charms character. Yeah, the leprechaun, thank you. It's always a big help to me when the audience steps in and fills in the blanks for my lapse of thought. The question was, do I find any positive Irish characters on TV or movies and whatnot? And in my opinion, I don't believe so, not particularly. I mean, I don't think we're looked at, treated as bad people or anything or like that. It just tends to be, maybe on a cop drama, there just happens to be somebody with an Irish name and you assume he's good because it's a crime drama. But in the grand scheme of things, I think that what we've been talking about today with my little Tomei is unexplored territory. Do we have anyone else? Yes, sir.
So, being that you study philosophy, it occurs to me that the problem is, do we live in a society of survival or do we live in a society of sharing? Because there's plenty to go around. And are we just living one or two generations beyond true survivalist living? But the echoes of that survivalist mentality, you know, still exist. Sort of like everybody was going to communism because all of the fascist people that were using people as slaves, but then it went back the other way and you got a Stalin. So that's all about power. So the question is, how do you really have a democracy where people aren't just, you know, how do you have sharing? How do you get rid of the survivalist bad habits and behavior of your parents so that you can see everybody as brothers and sisters? And has there ever been, because I don't know much history, I'm an engineer, has there ever been a time where that survivalist mentality has given way to a commonwealth where people really would rather share than take more cookies than they deserve?
There is a, at the end of the day, I believe, to truncate your question, you're asking about humanity, and I don't want to go and be flippant and say good versus evil, but survival versus our own self-implosion. Okay. The way, a book that I'm currently reading, which I know is available, should be available in Vroman, is The 12 Rules of Life by a Dr. Jordan Peterson. Now, I read different philosophy books for different reasons. And his postulate is the idea of the control of self before we as society gains control over ourselves. We can only do what we can to make our own lives put in order as opposed to chaos. Now, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of chaos in there. Without chaos, our society does not advance. But having said that, there is that fine balance between order and chaos. My belief is that the more of us seek the balance between order and chaos, the more likely society will find its middle ground and find a way to continue to grow without basically putting mushroom clouds over the northern hemisphere and Europe. So unfortunately, I didn't broach that question in the book, but in my opinion, I would probably consider thumbing through the Peterson book after you buy my book, and before you leave the store. There was one other thing I wanted to mention before, if anybody else had a question. I mentioned the lady was kind enough, Kelly was kind enough to mention that I was a comic. Vroman's Bookstore has always been one of my favorite places in Pasadena, even when I used to get booked over at the Ice House. This place always put me in a good mood before I would walk over there. And so I'm very thankful that I came out today. Oh, and one other thing about your question, you had asked about parents giving bad habits. My parents are saints. I'm a jerk. But I am Mickey Curran's little boy, James, so I wanted to let you guys know that. Do we have any other questions before I bring back Kelly? I appreciate all of your time. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you all so much for coming out and joining us this afternoon, evening, and coming out and supporting your local bookstores. Because of loyal customers like you that we're still here, so thank you. Let's give another round of applause for If you'd like to get a book signed, they'll stick around and sign it for you. Again, we do ask that you purchase your book guys to our registers. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday and the rest of your weekend. Have a